You know, I've been telling you lots of fun stories, but now I think I'd like to tell you a serious story. Serious stories can be fun too, of course, and all of them have lessons that we can learn, but usually a serious story is based on its lesson. And I hope this one will have one that'll be good for you. Change your life maybe a little bit, how you think about things. You know, I've been hearing this story all my life. When I was a kid, we moved to Alaska, and we lived 6 miles from Anchorage out in the middle of the forest. And my dad used to tell me, old Ephraim, I'm sure it was to keep me attentive as I was out picking berries in the little woods or over the highway in the big woods where there were bears. And when I came back to Utah and got into Troop 321, Vern and Winston, our scoutmasters, they knew all about old Ephraim. And they would tell the story, and they would take us up to old Ephraim's grave. There we would stand at the foot of that giant stone, 9 feet 11 inches tall, the same height as Goliath in the Bible. And we'd look up at the top of it, and then we knew what a big bear was. And I started telling the story myself. In fact, in 1980, when I published my first edition of Folk and Campfire Stories, Old Ephraim is in it. And then 1980, another great adventure happened. I was the district executive in the Lake Bonneville Council, Weaverview District, and I took my Order of the Arrow chapter. We went up to Utah State University, and there we went to the special collections to see old Ephraim's skull. We'd heard it was there. And sure enough, now it's still there today. You can go to the university library and ask to see it, but it's in a glass case, and you have to peek at it through the glass. But in those days, when we asked to see it, the curator brought us out an old pasteboard box, a little grease stain. And we pulled out open, and we took out old Ephraim's skull. I've got some pictures of it. I think I'll share them with you. Here's a picture of a bunch of the crew, all Camp Law staff members and OA members true, standing around and looking at old Ephraim's skull there on the table, the box by Ellis's elbow. I got a little closer when you notice this skull is, I said, 21 inches long, and that's without the snout. That's without the muscle and the hide and the hair. That's a big beast. Of course, so are Brian and Lynn, who are looking down, contemplating old Ephraim's skull. But as I said, I published that story, and I told it over and over again. And then one night I'm walking down the trail at Camp Law, looking out through the woods at the campfires, through the trees where the scoutmasters have their kids gathered around the fire, telling them tales and feeding them treats. And I come up along Camp Apache, and I could hear a big, powerful voice booming through the woods. One of the greatest storytellers that ever lived, Ross Rudd, out of Riverside, Utah. And he was telling the story of old Ephraim. And believe me, he knew the story of old Ephraim better than anyone alive at the time, because he knew Frank Clark. Portage isn't far from Riverside, and big old Ross had been to Frank Clark's home. He'd seen that bear hide, so big that the hind legs are on the ceiling, the body comes down the middle, and the head and front legs lay out on the floor. And he'd heard the story from Frank himself. And so I listened to his powerful, beautiful words, and they touched my heart. And his story and my story came together as this story. That's the way it is with bards, you know, clear back to Homer and beyond. That's the magic of being a storyteller. I hope you pick up on it. That's how we create truth and beauty. And I hope it'll give power to the lesson at the end. So here it is, the story of old Ephraim. You know, when you think of bears, you usually think of Alaska or Yellowstone. But we here in Utah have every right to be proud of our bear heritage. Because right here in Utah, we have one of the biggest bears ever recorded. His name was old Ephraim. He was named by the people of the Cache Valley who had to deal with him for years. And he was a powerful plains grizzly. A plains grizzly was one that lived out on the plains that hunted the buffalo. They know that because his bones ended up at the Smithsonian Institution where they could be studied and carefully identified. Then years later they were sent into Utah State where they still reside today. But there weren't many people in the Cache Valley in those days, nothing compared to now, especially the south end. In the summertime, about the only people you saw there were herdsmen, cattlemen, and sheep herders who would bring their flocks and herds up into the mountains to graze. Now these men knew how to deal with bears, and they had had bear trouble, and they knew how to solve it, till this one summer they started having really bad bear trouble. Of course, they're all looking around, and they could see that the source was all the same. The tracks were gigantic. But that wasn't the only thing that was particularly interesting about him. You see, a grizzly bear has 5 forward claws, 5 forward toes. But in this great bear track, there were only 3. So they assumed this bear had got himself into a trap when he was young. He got out, and he'd got out with a lesson that was now bringing them grief. They did everything they could. You see, when a grizzly bear attacks a flock of sheep, they'll all bunch up together to try to be safe. That great bear would wade in, striking from right and left with those great claws, kill 30 sheep in a night. He might eat one, he might eat a part of all. His choice. And they were frantic. They tried to put a bounty on his head, but they couldn't bring anyone in that knew any better than they could. So they hunted on throughout the summer. And then winter came. And there was a family out of Wellsville who had a family tradition of their own. They used to go up into the mountains every year once the snow got deep enough to hold the sled, and they'd gather firewood, big tree logs cut up and piled, and good branches that would make tinder piled on top, and they'd haul that load in on their horses on the sleigh. And they'd been out working on a day, and as sunset was drawing nigh, my granddad noticed that the sleigh was still harnessed to the horses. So he calls to one of his grandsons and says, "Hey, let's take a ride across the hill and over that willow bottom. See what we can find up on the next ridge for tomorrow's cutting." The boy was eager to go, and of course Granddad couldn't wait to be with him. So they jumped on the sleigh and they were on their way. They came down off the ridge and started off across the willow bottom. The wind had been blowing and the snow had drifted into a cornice over the creek. And that's a kind of dangerous thing to horses. Horses are aware of those things and a little nervous. And as they approached the creek, they started to balk and push back. Well, the old man knew they could make it. He knew the ford was there. So, a little disgusted, he jumped down off the sleigh and went around front, and he reached up and he grabbed the bits in his hands like this. He was going to pull those horses down into the creek and show them a thing or two. But just as he reached up there to grab them, up from behind a little willow bush, there stood this giant grizzly bear. 9 feet, 11 inches tall, the same height as Goliath in the Bible. And smash! He brought that old man down in the snow. The horses screamed and reared and turned and ran back off up the trail towards camp. The little boy hanging on as he came into camp crying, "The bear's got Granddad! The bear's got Granddad!" The men saddled their horses. They grabbed their rifles. They rode off down the trail in the dark. When they got there, they found their father dead. It was too dark to follow the trail that night. By morning, a layer of snow had buried every sight or sign of old Ephraim. They hunted on for weeks, but they figure he must have denned up right after that because they couldn't find him. The winter went over, but they'd been busy. They'd been to towns all up and down the Cache Valley with their broken hearts, and the money had piled up. And now, with the coming of spring, there was a bounty of $1,000 on old Ephraim's head. In those days, many a man had been hunted down for less than $1,000 back there at the turn of the 20th century. And so big game hunters came in from all over with their traps and their packs of dogs. But they had no more success than the sheep herders and the farmers and the folk at Cache Valley. A whole year went over, another winter season, cattle destroyed. A cattle's no match for a buffalo, and old Ephraim was matched for both. Flocks of sheep decimated, and yet no bear to be found. But in the spring, that second spring, there came a little man out of Portage, Utah, named Frank Clark. Frank brought his flock up into the Blacksmith Fork Canyon, up there to where it even bridged over into the Logan Canyon. And there he sent them out to graze. Well, it wasn't long before he started having bear trouble. Now, by this time in his life, Frank had killed 24 bears. So he figured he knew what he was about. And it wasn't just about tramping about the woods trying to find a bear. He was thinking like a bear. And he knew what a bear needed. A bear needed a wallow. You see, a bear's got a wallow every day. The ticks and the lice and the fleas get up into his hair and his fur, and if he doesn't lay down in the cool mud and cool water and drive them out, they'll drive him crazy. So Frank started looking up this big willow bottom. And sure enough, he got up in there a ways, not far from where he moved his sheep camp, and there was a great big bear wallow. 4 times the size of any bear wallow he'd ever seen. So then, leaving his buddy and his dogs in charge, he headed back down to Logan, to the blacksmith shop. And he had him make expeditiously 2 of the largest bear traps you've ever seen, 4 times the size of any bear trap Frank had ever used. I've seen him. I stood against him. I put my chin on the end of the top spring as they stood up on end. That's how tall they are. He took them back into the mountains with 12 feet of logging chain apiece. He took one of them and he took about 150 yards from his camp and laid it up there in the trees to weather. The other he took and rigged it to its drag. You know, you can't just take a bear trap and attach it to a standing tree or a big stone. The bear gets in that trap, he'll give a jerk, and out comes the paw or the chain will snap. But if you attach it to a heavy log, the bear will give a jerk and the log will come, but the trap won't come off. He can get it moving, but he can't get away. So Frank put that trap down in the bear wallow. He stirred up the water all black and mucky with a stick so that as the sediment settled down, it covered that trap up and hid it entirely. He ran the chain up the ditch, covered it up with sod and pine needles, buried the drag, and headed back to camp. In the evening, a shepherd's got time to cook his meal. The sheep are bedded down, the dog's on duty. Frank's buddy'd gone over the hill to his flock. Frank waited for any sight or sound of that bear. Not a peep that night. As soon as he could get things up and running in the morning, he headed up the bottom, up the creek to that bear wallow, and sure enough, that bear had been in there, but that trap was laying up on the bank like someone had taken a shovel and smanged it shut and thrown it up into the weeds, and that bear had been in for his bath. Well, Frank went through the whole process again, as careful as possible, and waited out the night. The next day the same, the trap on the bank, the bear in the mud and gone. 3rd night, 4th night, then came the 5th. Morning of the 6th day, Frank heads up the canyon. The bear had not been in the wallow. The trap was still set and there. Now Frank knew that the bear needed a wallow. He figured he had been working on it. And so he headed on up the canyon, a few more 100 yards, and sure enough, there he came to it. Brand new, cut out in the mud. A big new bear wallow, same size as before. Well, now Frank knew what that second trap was for. He headed back into the woods, but before he did, he shot a little muskrat. He took his blood in a pan, and he soaked his gloves. He steeped them in that muskrat's blood, and nothing, not the chain, not the trap, nothing he touched, but he did it with those blood-soaked gloves. And while he was up on the ridge, before he headed out, the gloves were soaking in the pan. He cut himself a lodgepole just as tall as he could carry. and he brought it down with it, and he set it up there just down from the bear wallow as part of his gear. And then, bloody gloves on his hands, he set that trap, and he rigged the chain, he buried the drag. And then he took that lodgepole and he laid it out over the top of that bear wallow. And then, bear trap in hand, he worked his way out along that lodgepole till he got to the middle of the bear wallow, and he put it down in. And then he took a stick, and again he stirred up the mud all O'Reilly black. And then he walked off, and he picked up that lodgepole and he carried it off back to camp. Left everything sealed and covered, and not a sound, a sight, or a scent of man. Well, that night, he listened through time to go to bed. Figured tomorrow would be a busy day, so he ought to get to sleep, and he lay down to sleep. In the middle of the night, he was awakened. The first thing that woke him up was his dog just barking and screaming. And then as he listened, he could hear roaring and bellowing and screaming itself just up the canyon, right up the willow bottom, that great bear, and he knew he had him. He jumped out of bed, he put on his hat, he pulled on his boot, he's wearing his long johns, his all red long johns. He grabbed his rifle, his 25, 30, that's the gun just bigger than a 22. There it is right there. It's a varmint gun, okay? It's not a big rifle, it's not a big shell. Holds 8 rounds in the magazine. And he headed up the canyon towards that first bear wallow. He got there, and there's no sign of the bear. So he knew where he was. He headed up for that second bear wallow. But when he got there, the bear wasn't there. So then he listened. And he could hear back between him and his camp, he could hear that bear screaming. Now I don't know what you would have done. I know what I'd have done. I'd have headed to the nearest big tree up on the ridge, and that's where I'd have spent the night. But not Frank Clark. Frank heard where that bear was, and with that little rifle he headed for the roar. When he got there, there was nothing there, but he listened about. When he heard him again, he'd head for that. Thus he played hide and seek all night long in that willow bottom with that grizzly bear. Then, as just the first light of dawn was coming, he's looking around in the marsh. He could see a little knoll rising up, just a little hump of sand, but it was drained enough that no willows grew upon it. And so he climbed up to the top of it, and he looked out over the willow marsh and mist, the steam rising up from the willow bottom. He's searching around, and he hears a noise behind him. He turned around, and there coming for him, walking up on its hind legs, was that giant grizzly bear, 9 feet 11 inches tall, the height of Goliath, that great trap on his paw, wrapped around his arm like a bracelet, 12 feet of logging chain, and swinging back and forth like a giant charm, an 8-foot log. And that bear knew where his trouble came from, and he was looking right at Frank, and walking step at a time towards him. Now it does no good to shoot a bear in the face. That solid bone of his forehead will turn even a heavy rifle shell. So Frank aimed right at the heart and put in the first round. Not even a wince out of old Ephraim. He put in the second and the third. Oh yeah, the blood started to come, but so was the bear. 4 and 5. He's still coming. 6, 7. Only 1 round left. And just then, up out of the swamp, there came this little sheepdog. And Frank always credited that dog for saving his life. Because that little dog jumped up and it grabbed that big bear right here on the tendon on the back of his knee. And when old Ephraim turned like this to brush that dog away, there was the back of his ear. And that's where the last round went. And thump, old Ephraim came down on that grassy mound. Frank tried to roll him over, but he couldn't. He went back and got his buddy. The two of them with levers got him rolled over. He was gigantic. They skinned him out. You know, when you skin a bear, he looks just like a man. And as he did so, Frank began to feel a little bad. I mean, he knew he was a killer. He knew he destroyed many a flock of sheep. He'd killed Frank's sheep. He'd killed a man. But he was a great wild creature. He was living in the wild and doing what wild creatures do. He began to regret a little he'd killed him. So he and his pal, they built a pyre over the top of old Ephraim. They burned him, and then they piled the stones over his bones, and they headed back. As I said, years went over, and a Boy Scout troop came up out of Logan, Utah, and Troop 1, and they unburied those bones and took that skull and sent it into the Smithsonian Institute. And years later, the Smithsonian sent it to Utah State University, where you can go see it today in a glass case in the special collection. Now, there are a lot of lessons that we can get from the story of old Ephraim. We can start with old Ephraim, who was powerful and strong, and learned the lessons of his youth to make his adult life powerful and productive. We can learn the lesson of Frank Clark. Frank Clark, who used his mind to outwit the bear, used his skill to destroy his enemy, used his skill to fight against a power much, much greater than himself. But I think the most important lesson is this: no matter how powerful nature is, no matter how great its creation, man must be careful, because we have the power for good or for ill to destroy.